This is the 5-minute guide to the SMS Goeben, a Moltke class battlecruiser of the Imperial German Navy, and later the Ottoman Navy. And then the Turkish Navy. It's a bit complicated. So this is going to take a bit longer than 5 minutes. The Goeben started life as a Moltke class battlecruiser in service to Imperial Germany. For details on the ship's armament and other technical capabilities, please see the video on the class in general, which I will link at the end of this video. The Moltke class were the second German battlecruisers to be designed, but it would not be until the Der Flieger class, the fourth design, that Germany would ever operate battlecruisers of the same class together. This is because her story is nearly unique in history, let alone the German Navy. The Goeben was completed in July 1912 and had only spent 3 months in active service before the outbreak of the First Balkan War meant the German High Command decided that Germany needed an active naval presence in the Mediterranean to exert their growing power in this area. Therefore, in company with the cruiser Breslau, the Goeben was sent to cruise around various parts of the Adriatic Sea, basing itself out of the port of Pala, which belonged to the friendly Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time. Effectively, the ship's job was to sail around saying, "Look at me, I'm big and shiny and powerful, and if you annoy me, I have a lot of explosives on board, which I will deliver to you with great speed. So don't mess with me, or the country whose flag I fly." This seemed to go relatively well, and when the Second Balkan War broke out, the ships were kept in the area, repeating their cruises around the area, ironically at the same time demonstrating which partner was the superior ally, since the Goeben far outclassed anything the Austro-Hungarian Navy had in service at the time, with the possible exception of the Tjethov-class dreadnoughts that were only just starting to come into service. The Germans planned to bring her home and replace her with the Moltke, but the circumstances surrounding the outbreak of the First World War made this impossible, even though the ship's engines desperately needed repairs, so engineers had to be sent from Germany to Poland to replace most of the inner workings of the ship's boilers. With her speed restored, and perfectly aware war was about to break out, and the ship could well be trapped in the Adriatic Sea, the ship made of the port of Messina, which would allow it to go pretty much anywhere in the Mediterranean, if the need arose. War broke out in stages, and initially the ship followed its orders to attack French shipping and positions in the western Mediterranean. But the German admirals could see where things were heading, and ordered Goeben and Breslau to head for the Ottoman Empire as soon as possible. Turning back to Messina for coal, they came across the British battlecruisers Indefatigable and Indomitable. Germany was not yet at war with Britain, but both sides knew it was only a matter of time, so they exchanged steely glances as they slipped past each other, and the British rather unsubtly did a 180-degree turn and started following the German ships. With its partially refreshed engines, the Goeben proved a faster ship and outran the British, who suffering their own engine troubles, but would now be delayed refueling in port, whilst a third British battlecruiser, the Inflexible, was also fueling up in its own port and about to join the chase. It should be noted at this point that the declaration of war between Britain and Germany happened only hours after the two sides first met, so this was an incredibly lucky escape. At this point there were 3 battlecruisers, 4 armored cruisers, and over a dozen light cruisers and destroyers all waiting for the Goeben to make the wrong move. However, luck stayed with the ship. Due to a series of miscommunications and misjudgments, the armored cruisers broke off pursuit hours before they could have engaged, and the other ships mostly tried to block Goeben and Breslau from re-entering the Adriatic Sea. But of course the ship was not going there, and by the time anyone had figured this out, the Goeben was halfway to Turkey. But this wasn't the end of things. Technically the Ottoman Empire was still neutral, and negotiations began for entry through the Dardanelles Straits, and now every British ship in the Mediterranean and even some of the French were pouring after them as fast as possible. The ship finally got clearance to proceed, just as the smoke of the pursuing British battlecruisers came over the horizon. Here is a good illustration of those exciting days.
Mine. Mine.
Due to the slight issue of the Ottomans still being officially neutral, the ships were supposedly sold to the Ottoman Navy. If by sale you mean they had the same crew, the same commander, fought the same enemies, and the ship's admiral was now made commander of the Ottoman Navy. Basically the flag changed, and that was about it. Well, that and the ships also changed name. The Goeben became the Yavuz Sultan Selim and Breslau was renamed Midili. And everyone got to wear a fez, so I guess there are some happy endings after all. Well, not quite. Shortly afterwards the Ottomans joined the war on the German side anyway, but the Yavuz now spent its time harassing the Russians. However, despite the Black Sea Fleet only having pre-dreadnoughts, the Russians had practice coordinating all their ships together to try and make up for individual inferiority, and this led to an inconclusive engagement with damage to both sides. Although given that it was the entire Black Sea Fleet against the Yavuz, this is probably a technical win for the not German ship. But hitting two mines in separate incidents and late in 1914 seemed to indicate that the ship's luck was running out. 1915 was somewhat inconclusive. Another engagement with Russian battleships, numerous escort missions and a brief attempt at interfering with the Gallipoli landings didn't add up to much, with the latter attempt being driven off by the 15-inch guns of the HMS Queen Elizabeth. At the end of the year the Russians completed 2 dreadnought battleships, further boxing in the ship from freedom of operation. 1916 and 1917 continued this trend, with the main operation of note being an engagement with one of the Russian dreadnoughts that again was inconclusive, but the ship was being worn down by constant use, little to no repair and a lack of coal. From the earlier video on the Greek cruiser Avarov and the German Brandenburg class pre-dreadnoughts you might be starting to recognize these as occupational hazards of being part of the Ottoman Navy. However, this enforced lack of use meant the German crew fixed up what they could, and with the Russians dropping out of the war by 1918 the ship was reasonably operational again. Operations started well, sinking the British monitors Raglan and M28 in a surprise attack, and finding a British pre-dreadnought raising steam alone nearby. But then everything went wrong. The Expresslaw struck a number of mines and sank. Yavuz also struck 3 mines, and had to be beached, whereupon it was bombed and shelled repeatedly, just escaping before a British submarine arrived to finish the job thanks to a tow from a Turkish pre-dreadnought that hadn't quite broken down just yet. After extensive repairs and some operations surrounding the final treaty of Russian surrender, the ship almost ended up in Allied hands as part of the treaty between the Ottomans and the Allies at the end of the war. However, the revolution that destroyed the Ottoman Empire and founded the modern state of Turkey scrapped that treaty and the ship stayed in Turkish hands. A long and confused series of events vaguely directed at repairing the ship now occurred, but she was still unfit for sea duty in 1928 when the Greek Navy conducted a large-scale exercise off the Turkish coast. Suddenly motivated, the ship was refitted and ready for service by 1930 with her name shorted to Yavuz Sultan, although her armor was not updated and she would be vulnerable to long-range plunging fire. The Turkish Navy planned to keep her in service until 1945, when she would be replaced by another similar-sized ship, but the outbreak of World War II meant that all the shipyards Turkey had ordered ships from were now unable to fulfill the orders, a somewhat ironic situation given that exactly the same thing had happened in the First World War. As a result, she stayed in service and met the USS Missouri on an official visit to Turkey in 1946, before being decommissioned from active duty in 1950. However, for a brief period between 1952 and 1954 she was technically part of the NATO Reserve Fleet. In 1963 the Turkish government offered to sell her back to West Germany as a museum ship, but the offer was declined. Sadly therefore, despite being the lone remaining dreadnought warship outside the United States, she was scrapped in the mid-1970s. Ironically, for a ship that was barely in German service for a few years, her lifespan was almost half again greater than the total lifespan of Imperial Germany, the state that had created her. That's it for this extended video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below.